Hi there, this is Erica Merrill, and I am the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And I'm very fortunate to be sitting down today with attorney Tim Stickradt. And he is a bankruptcy attorney out of Michigan. Today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and it is the reason that people don't file for bankruptcy but should. I would love to welcome you to the show today, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for having me again.
You are welcome. So let's get right into it. I mean, you deal with this every single day. You sit down with, how many people do you sit down with a week?
I mean, in a normal week, probably 20 to 30 people.
Okay, so you hear a lot of stories, people's life stories, and why they come to you. What is their reasoning behind coming in and finding out what their options are. And I think a lot of it is that life happens. So I'd like to start this interview off with talking about some of those life events that happen, because I know that you've heard them all, and it's not always the person's fault that they got into this. There's plenty of unforeseen situations. So let's start off with talking about medical bills.
Sure, yeah, and I would just say that most of the time, it's not the person's fault that they need to discuss the option of bankruptcy. Medical bills are a great point. I mean, that's a great one to lead off with, because nobody intentionally gets sick. People get sick. Maybe they don't have health insurance coverage. Maybe their coverage has a high copay. It could be any number of things. But when they get sick and they have those medical bills, those are dischargeable in bankruptcy. And so if it gets beyond what a person can afford to pay, they should at least seek an attorney's advice on that as to whether bankruptcy is a good option.
That's really good to know. I mean, so sometimes we're talking about they themselves getting sick. Sometimes we're talking about a family member that they are taking care of that gets very sick and they get buried under medical bills. And then there's a third option that a lot of people don't think about, is that, if they get in a car accident and they hit somebody and they don't have insurance to cover the medical costs of the other person and they're found at fault, then they've got somebody else's medical bills to pay and a personal injury case. Can you tell us a little bit about a situation like that and what could happen?
Yes, and Erica, this is something that we see all too often. Someone will be in a car and they'll be driving along and they'll get into a car accident and realize their insurance lapsed or they didn't pay their premium, and now they're driving without insurance and they've just gotten into an accident. And what happens in Michigan then is if they're sued for some type of personal injury claim, let's just say the person that was involved in the accident with them is injured, and they sue my would-be client, that person is going to be on the hook for the medical bills, for the damages to the vehicle, to the person's injury damages. And sometimes that's to a tune of $100,000 or more. And the other thing that happens then is, in the state of Michigan, if those debts aren't dealt with, the person's driver's license is suspended. So they end up with no license, no way to get to work, no way to get to and from where they need to go, and with this monster bill that they still owe. And filing a bankruptcy case will actually cure that problem. It'll eliminate the debt that they owe completely, and it will allow them to get their driver's license reinstated.
Well, see, now that's really great information that somebody probably doesn't have. I mean, I know that a lot of times people are under this debt and they're blinded by what they're looking at for bills, and they really can't see a way out of it because the numbers are so large when it comes to medical bills. And so what would you say to somebody that is dealing with giant bills like that, and they just is there a process that they should go through in making a decision to come in when they're looking at bills and kind of doing the checks and balances of what they're making versus if they'll ever be able to pay it off?
Yeah, there is, and I think people would be better served if they were more proactive about it. Uh, it's always a good idea to talk to a lawyer or talk to an expert in dealing with debts, because I think a lot of times people procrastinate, or they put things off for various reasons. It could just be that they're afraid of what's down the road, they're unsure. Maybe a family member is telling them that they shouldn't discuss bankruptcy, that that's a bad idea. Maybe they're just very hopeful that the problem will solve itself. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's instinctively how we think as humans. But the bottom line is when something like that comes to you and it's something that you know you can't handle, okay? And I'm not talking about like a $2,000 bill. I mean, yeah, that's a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to downplay that, but I'm talking about something that we're never going to be able to afford to pay, like a $50,000 or a $100,000 or a $200,000 bill, which does sometimes, oftentimes, come from these types of lawsuits. That's when you really need to think about talking to someone, because the reality is you're never going to pay that back. You're not going to win the lottery. You can't book on that. You just have to face facts and get some help. And what you find is that once people come in and meet with me, and I see this, I can see that they're visibly shaken when they walk in the door. Many times they're nervous, that you can hear their voices are quaky, but after maybe 10 minutes, I just see the shoulders kind of relax, and I can tell that they're in a better place. And then that whole time that they were kind of afraid or worried about nothing. But it's really hard to get past that, and it's difficult for me to explain that until someone actually takes the first step and comes and talks to me. And then when people leave our consultations, I mean, 100 times out of 100, they feel so much better. They're going to get sleep at night. They're going to be able to communicate with their spouse or their kids better. They're going to do a better job at work. Everything just gets better from that point. Just the knowing that there is a resolution, something that we can do to resolve that issue. It just means so much to put people, back at ease.
Absolutely. I feel like information is power. And so when you have the information to make the right decisions, then, your path seems so much more clear than when you're just under the fog of depression and like just looking at this giant problem that seems like a mountainous thing that you need to solve. And so, it's awesome for them to come in and talk to someone like you and really get an idea of the real size of their problem and look at some real solutions, see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to talk a little bit more about your process in a little while. But I'd like to move on to one of the next reasons that people end up filing for bankruptcy. And, a lot of people end up filing for bankruptcy because of a divorce. And, that can be, reasons anywhere from, the extra bills of living in two places to, just depression and, not being able to be as productive at work. And so, and that's a real thing. I mean, people kind of brush that off, but I'd love to hear from you and your experience with people that come in with this issue and end up filing for bankruptcy.
Yeah, bankruptcy and divorce unfortunately go hand in hand, and there's so many layers to that. When you divorce, think of it this way: you're taking two incomes in one household and moving that out to two different households. So you essentially double your expenses, and your income's cut in half. So you don't have all the money you had coming in. And in many cases, one person is paying spousal support or child support, perhaps. And then you're finding a new place to live, paying different rent, setting all that up. In a lot of cases, there's a residual bill from the divorce lawyer that is sitting out there still unpaid. So there's so many reasons that someone who filed a divorce would come to a bankruptcy attorney. Oftentimes, we'll have people come to us while they're contemplating divorce. And this is actually interesting because this can be a really good move. It's good to kind of get an opinion from a bankruptcy attorney before you go into divorce, if you can. What I mean by that is you could save some money by doing that. Sometimes just getting all of the combined joint debts out of the way before you divorce, it'll eliminate one issue that you would litigate in divorce as to who owes what. So if you can walk into a divorce situation, if it's inevitable, without any joint debt or without any individual debts, you've just saved some time and probably some money in the divorce process. You've streamlined that process a little bit, especially if you're going to file bankruptcy anyway, and you come out of a divorce to file bankruptcy. Now you're both filing. You have to file two different cases, so it costs twice as much, right? Also, some of the debts may not be dischargeable because of the wording in the divorce judgment. So it's always a good idea to plan ahead, and it's difficult because you're facing two ugly prospects, and you're saying, okay, I know I'm getting divorced, and I think I need to file bankruptcy, and now I have to go in and talk to an attorney with the person that I'm divorcing. So it's not comfortable, but it can oftentimes prove to be the smartest move.
That is so true. It's better to have the information going into another terrible situation, and that's for sure. And so many people are blindsided and they don't have that option. But if you and your partner are talking things through, and being level-headed about it, and just really trying to look to the future and how things might play out, almost like a playbook. If this happens, then that'll happen. If this happens, then that'll happen. Well, maybe bankruptcy is going to help you have a better outcome in the long run, rather than paying a lot of extra bills to attorneys, and possibly even causing more fights in the long run, and losing things that you didn't want to lose. So, I think that that's really, really smart for people to come in and at least talk to you and find out what their options are if they are planning on going through a divorce.
On a similar subject, really, or on a more broader base, I guess, looking ahead and discussing bankruptcy options before you necessarily take the step is oftentimes a good idea, even when bankruptcy may not be first thing on your mind. You need to think about these things not only before a divorce, but before you start a business. You always want to be looking at worst case scenarios. How do I set up a business so that if it doesn't work, God forbid, I can take the necessary steps to get out from under any debt I incur. Or sometimes people will instinctively run to their 401k or their IRA and liquidate a bunch of money and try and pay down some debts, only to wind up filing bankruptcy eventually anyway. Those situations are heartbreaking because I have to tell the person, hey, you could have done this and saved all that money you spent. And so again, it's always good to just get a feel for what bankruptcy is about, even if it's not necessarily on your radar, but if it's just a possibility down the road. It's a good idea to consult with an attorney like me before you actually do something besides filing bankruptcy, because there are a lot of ways to save money and set yourself up before you file bankruptcy, or possibly get a definitive reason why you don't need to file or you shouldn't file.
That is really great information to have. So, and the other thing I want to mention is, because of a divorce, that a lot of times that is when you find out that your spouse had a double life, and that you might or might not be, in real trouble. I've heard of people that didn't realize that their house was about to be foreclosed upon because their spouse was taking care of that bill, and actually they weren't taking care of the bill, because they were under all the stress. They didn't feel either comfortable talking about it with their spouse. They were embarrassed. We're going to get into more of that stuff later, but you might find out that your spouse had a gambling problem, and that you thought you had all this money saved and they took it all out. Your spouse might have been stealing from you, and none of your assets are there. There's a lot of crazy things that happen with divorce that take people by surprise. And so I'm sure that you see people, in all different situations when it comes to divorce. But there are definitely some things that happen that are not your fault and you didn't even know about. Now, maybe you could have tried to ask some more questions, or of your spouse, but sometimes people really hide these things well, and you find out later that you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's so true. And I can think of one example of that right off the top of my head. Years ago, I had a client who came to me and she said that she had just found out her husband had a settlement from a personal injury case, and she might be entitled to some of the proceeds from the settlement. But the spouse had told her, no way, you're not entitled to any of that. And he convinced her she wasn't. Well, in talking to me, we decided that she probably was, probably quite a bit of money, in fact. So she also had some debt. So we were able to file the bankruptcy. Now, she couldn't exempt all of the money that she was entitled to, but it forced the issue, and it got the bankruptcy trustee on her side. And the bankruptcy trustee then went after the spouse for some of that money, and she was able to recover some of it, and some of it went to her creditors. So it was kind of a win-win for her. She wound up getting something out of it, actually enriching herself while getting rid of her debts. And there's that kind of unseen thing. I took it to her spouse a little bit, and that made her feel better too. So you never know. You always want to ask the questions. It's so important to get the information.
Well, I really think karma is a real thing sometimes. So, sometimes, things work out a certain way, and, eventually the ground gets evened out. So, and that's not a bad thing. So that's great. Let's talk a little bit about bills. There's a huge thing that happens, with credit and bills and late fees, and things just pile up, and you want to ignore it because it's a terrible problem, and you don't want to think about it, but you can see where you create the perfect storm sometimes by not facing these things head on. And I'd love to hear your take on what happens with bills and late payments and credit card fees, high interest loans. I mean, those sorts of things.
Yeah, it will continue to get worse until you actually do something proactively to make it better. Whether that is calling the creditors up and just trying to offer them something, maybe that would make you feel better to do that first. That's not a bad idea. Or talking to a bankruptcy attorney or filing bankruptcy, because there comes a point for all of us where it's too much. We can't afford it. That amount varies. It's different for everybody. But once you hit that point and you're actually underwater, it only gets worse because the interest continues to compound, and the late fees and the penalties continue to be added on, and the debt just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. You're farther and farther under until you actually take some steps. I think the problem is, though, the deeper you get, the more insurmountable it seems, and people just shut down because of that. And I get it. I mean, I understand that. That feeling is horrible. You don't want to ever have to go through that, and I don't wish that on anybody, but you just have to think this through, try and use your head, and just think, there's got to be a solution. I got to talk to somebody. There's got to be a way out of this, because 100 times out of 100, there really is. There's always something we can do. There's always a solution. It's just a matter of finding it. Sometimes it's a real easy solution. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. Sometimes it might hurt a little, but a lot less than it hurts right now. So you always have to be positive and think there is a way out, but it's just not going to happen to you. All right? The solution's not going to find you. You have to find it. And again, that's why I just encourage people to call me and just ask questions, get information, be educated. Because sometimes the problem's not as bad as it seems.
Well, I mean, the problems always seem a lot worse when you don't have the right information to make the right decisions. And so I think those are really great points that you're making. And I want to mention this before we jump off into the next topic, which is going to be the reasons that people don't file for bankruptcy. And I think one of the number one reasons is fear and pride. And we'll tackle those. But sometimes when people are going through a bankruptcy, they've never been to an attorney for any reason before. Or maybe they have, and it wasn't a good experience, and they felt, insignificant, and they felt embarrassed, whatever the reason is. I want to just say, from knowing the people here at HS&A for over 3 years, every time I've met you and your wife Peggy, Tim, you guys are just very down to earth and just the nicest people and empathetic. And I think that is a huge part of doing what you do. You have to be empathetic. You're not here to look down on someone and tell them, well, you got yourself in this mess, you should have done XYZ, and then you wouldn't be here. That's not it. You are there to help people look for solutions. And now it might be a strange topic, but I'd like to talk about some of the reasons people either put off or don't file for bankruptcy. And what you've seen. I mean, they might be missing out. It might not be for them, but they also it maybe should have done it. And so if you can talk to one of the first things that we talked about when preparing for this interview was that they're really afraid they're going to lose something. Maybe it's a piece of property that was in their family. So they're worried that they're going to lose something that's really important to them, because when you file for bankruptcy, you have to list everything that you own that has value, right? And so can you speak a little bit to that and maybe what people can keep and you've seen people keep versus what they might definitely have to lose?
Yes. Well, first of all, most of the time, the only thing you lose when you file bankruptcy is debt and stress. Most of the time. I mean, the vast majority of the time. There are situations, there are cases where assets can be liquidated, but again, that's why you go through the consultation. That's why you talk to me first. In most cases, you can keep all of your assets. You can keep your house or your apartment or your car, your computer, your personal assets. None of that stuff goes anywhere. It's only when you have assets that have more equity than what the law allows us to protect. That's the only time that those assets are in any jeopardy. And when that happens, most of the time we're able to file for a different type of bankruptcy that requires you to pay back a little bit of the debt, but not lose the assets. So again, the vast majority of the time, you're not losing any property or assets. And occasionally, some people don't care that they lose an asset. Maybe there's a car that they just can't afford and they want to get rid of it. It's a positive thing for them. Then filing a Chapter 7 allows them to just give that car back to the bank, even though they've got too many miles on it and the car is, in crappy shape or whatever it might be, and they owe $25,000 and the car's worth $4,000. They get to give it away, give it back to the bank, and they don't owe the balance. So sometimes giving up an asset, if you want to call it that, is a good thing. But again, I can't say it enough. You're not going to lose anything the vast majority of the time. Most people just don't. And if that is a possibility, I can work around that. I can give you ways that we can get through that or get past that, so we minimize your loss.
Wow, that is so good to know. And it really does, like I like to talk about myth busters when it comes to the law sometimes. And I really feel like, some of the stuff we're going to be talking about here in this segment, they're really myths that people, they have this belief and they haven't talked to a professional, but they have this belief. And so it keeps them from getting their life back on track. And so we'll go into the next one where, a lot of people feel like, oh my God, if I file for bankruptcy, my credit is going to be ruined forever. I'll never be able to buy a house. I'll never be able to, buy a car or anything of value where I need a loan. And that's simply, not true. And I'd love to hear what your take is on that. And I'm sure you hear this a lot from people.
All the time. And that might be the biggest myth out there. People think that they file bankruptcy and their credit will be destroyed forever. So let's back up a second. When you file bankruptcy, most of the time, most people that I file bankruptcy for have fallen behind on something, whether it's a credit card payment or a car payment or something else. And that alone has damaged or nearly destroyed their credit. It doesn't take much to hurt your credit. You can go from 750 to 500 in a real short period of time just by missing a few months of payments. And that's usually where people start out. And so What they are not doing is they're not looking at where they are right now. The credit score is already trashed. So what do we do about that? Well, first of all, filing bankruptcy eliminates the debts that destroyed the credit score. And it also prevents those creditors from further damaging the score, because once the bankruptcy is filed, those creditors don't report bad things to the credit bureaus any longer. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, part of our services involve a credit rebuilding program that we offer at no additional cost, actually. We just enroll people in this credit rebuilding program. And the idea is to bring the credit score up to 720, that's the threshold, 720, as quickly as possible. Typically that takes at a minimum 8 months, at the very most a couple of years, usually somewhere in the year to 18-month range. And I'm talking about someone who's at, say, 480. They can get their credit score up to 700 in that time frame, which seems crazy, but it's true. And as far as getting credit down the road, I mean, that's what rebuilding your credit score is all about. I mean, you may come into a bankruptcy situation saying, I don't want credit anymore, ever again, it's evil, it's awful, and I get that. What I think you should be saying is, I don't want to fall behind or take on more than I can handle ever again. Because credit is a good thing. Having good credit can be a good thing. You need to buy a car. If you need to finance a vehicle, would you rather finance a vehicle at 2% interest or 15% interest? Because the difference in your car payment is going to be probably $150 a month. And that's all going to interest. So filing at, with a 720 score versus even a 650 score makes a huge, huge difference. And coming out of a bankruptcy, you'll be able to finance a car very quickly. The only thing that takes any time really is if you're looking to buy a house and get a conventional mortgage loan. Normally, you'll have to probably wait anywhere from 24 to 36 months to get a mortgage coming out of a bankruptcy. But that's just because the banks want to see at least 2 years, a solid 2 years of no blips, no penalties, no late payments, nothing bad over a 24-month period. But if you're already damaged, if you're already way behind or in default, or you have judgments against you, you have to file bankruptcy or pay off those creditors to start that 2-year clock ticking. Otherwise, it's never going to start. You're going to sit there on your hands and wait, and your credit score is not going to get any better. And I have clients who go to these companies who promise that they'll scrub their credit reports, and that's a scam. I mean, really what it does is they'll basically dispute on the client's behalf certain things on the credit report, and the credit bureau will remove them temporarily. So they'll see their score go from 550 to 700 and then back down to 550 again, because the credit bureaus catch on to that rather quickly. I also have clients who go into these debt consolidation programs. Now, if you're listening to this interview at all, listen to this part. Those things are horrible, absolutely horrible. What they do is they tell you they're going to negotiate and settle your debts. And in turn, you pay them a certain amount of money for a period of usually 4 years. And then during that time, what they're doing is they're contacting your creditors and trying to resolve your debts. Okay, there's two big problems with that though. One is that almost never will they be able to solve all of your debt problems. They're not going to be able to settle with all of your creditors. And so when that happens, the creditors who don't settle, or the ones who are down the list further, get impatient, and they'll start to sue you, and they'll eventually start to garnish your wages, which then doesn't leave you enough money to make the payment, and then the whole program implodes. The other problem they don't tell you about is that when you do settle a debt with a creditor like that, I'll give you an example. Let's say you owe American Express $10,000. And your debt consolidator is able to settle it for $4,000. So you pay $4,000, you get rid of $6,000. Sounds like a sweet deal, right? Well, what they don't tell you is that $6,000 that you didn't pay becomes taxable income at the end of the year, and you'll get a 1099 form that you have to file with your taxes, which will either eat away at your refund if you normally get a refund, or it will create a tax liability for you. And if you add that one to 3 more settlements, it just compounds the problem. Now compare that with filing bankruptcy. A bankruptcy discharge just wipes out the debt. You don't have to pay it back, and there's no taxable consequence there. You do not have to pay taxes on that discharged debt.
That is such an important point for you to make, because people do not realize with those programs that you do have to pay taxes later, and that's a gotcha at the end of the year. And when you had plans for your refund, or you had other debts that you wanted to pay off, or things that you were planning with your family, and then all of a sudden you've got to pay 5, 10, 20,000, who knows what the amount is in taxes, depending on what the debt size was. So important for you to bring that up, and that is a big reason why you should consider bankruptcy over debt consolidation. But of course, like we keep mentioning this, come in, talk to Tim and Peggy, and they will tell you about, you don't want me to say that, do you? Talk to the attorneys at HS&A, and they will tell you what your options are, and really make sure that you're set up the right way. So let's talk a little bit about another one of the main reasons that people either put off or don't file for bankruptcy, and they should, and that is really pride and embarrassment, because people really like to achieve goals, they like to be successful in life, and they feel like bankruptcy is just a big advertisement for them missing the mark and ruining their lives, and maybe having some terrible consequences when it comes to their family, or just maybe there are other people that are affected by this bankruptcy, or by the fact that they've had these problems for a long time. And so I would love to have you talk a little bit about the people that come in. I know you mentioned earlier that you see the stress go away, and I love that. So tell me a little bit about the pride that people have for not being able to pay their bills, and not really wanting to face that fact and taking it very personally.
Well, I think, everybody has that type of pride to some extent, which can be a positive thing, or in some cases a negative thing. And I think that as it relates to bankruptcy, it's kind of waned in recent years. And I say that because I've done this for a little over 20 years now. And even back when I started doing bankruptcy cases back in the late 90s, I noticed that, that was a big factor. Nobody wanted anyone to know their business. And rest assured, we're not going to tell anybody. But nowadays, I can tell just based on the number of referrals I get that more and more people are willing to talk about their business to help someone else. So I think that's a very positive thing. But, think of it this way. If pride is really the factor, if you're embarrassed because of this, remember, many of these cases stem from something that happened that had nothing to do with you or were beyond your control. For example, you were laid off, you lost your job, your industry shut down and you lost your business. You got sick and you were in the hospital for 3 months and you couldn't work. Those things are beyond your control. Those are nothing to be embarrassed about. And you know what? Maybe you were just irresponsible and frivolous with your credit cards. Well, guess what? None of us are perfect. We've all exercised bad judgment at some point in time in our lives. You're lying to yourself if you say that hasn't happened. So maybe this is the time that you didn't use great judgment or discretion, and you ended up, hurting yourself and getting into debt. It is what it is. It's not reason to be embarrassed. And the sooner that you remedy the situation, the less likely anybody is going to find out about it. Because, if you just file bankruptcy and get it done with, and your credit score is back to where it was, well, look at it this way. Let's say you have to buy a vehicle. Well, now you can just go buy a vehicle and finance the car. Versus if you're in a situation where maybe your debts have mounted and you haven't addressed the situation and your credit score is tanked and you need to buy a car. Now you have to go ask someone for, to lend you a car or to co-sign for a vehicle for you. And then the cat's out of the bag, right? You screwed up, your debts are bad, or you've got a lot of debt. So by getting ahead of it and filing the bankruptcy that, again, nobody has to know about, I'm not going to tell anybody. You don't have to tell anybody. It's your private business. Maybe just getting ahead of it is the way to avoid the embarrassment altogether. and as far as a pride thing goes, I think you just have to swallow that sometimes. And I know that can be hard to do. Swallowing pride is not easy. You don't want to have to admit defeat or failure. But again, I'll reiterate, the fact of the matter is that the bankruptcy isn't the failure. Bankruptcy is the solution. That's taking care of business. That's solving problems. That's stuff you should be proud of. Getting hit and sitting there and letting it control you, that's the stuff that really should cause the embarrassment and the damage to your pride. So try and spin the way you think, because bankruptcy is not the problem. Bankruptcy is the solution. Bankruptcy, I tell people, when they come to me and they say, well, I just can't believe this happened to me, I'm filing bankruptcy. And I say, filing bankruptcy didn't happen to you. The bad stuff, that already happened to you. Bankruptcy is something that you're doing, that you're controlling, and you're taking over the situation. It's a tool in your toolbox, so use it.
That is such a great attitude toward it. I really appreciate your bringing that up, because there's so many times in life where you are your own obstacle and you don't realize it until somebody who is on the outside of the situation can look at it and say, look, if you did this, and this, your life would flow again the way that you want it to. But unfortunately, you're gumming up the works and you need to look at this like a business almost. How am I going to make this run a little more efficiently? Well, sometimes you need to trim some fat here and there and look for solutions to make it profitable again. And so, I love that you're talking about that. And the last thing we were going to talk about was fear of the unknown. And that's going to come into our last segment because, well, actually, no, let me back up. Someone tells you something. There's a lot of myths in bankruptcy, and someone might have told you something that happened to them or something they saw on TV, or there's just a lot of stuff about lawyers everywhere, and there's a lot of misconceptions. And unfortunately, sometimes there are lawyers that just want to close a deal, and they might have done someone that they know wrong. So they tell you, look, don't file for bankruptcy. It ruined so-and-so's life, and it'll ruin yours. When in fact, everybody's case is unique and different. And you guys are very honest lawyers. You're not looking to just close a bunch of cases. You're looking to help the people that actually need to be helped. And that is a part of the process we're going to talk about in a minute. But I'd love for you to dispel that myth that bankruptcy isn't for you because of what happened to my friend, kind of a situation.
Yeah, I get that all the time. In fact, when I consult with somebody, if they've talked to somebody else, that can go one of two ways. It usually does. If they've talked to someone who filed, most of the time, the person I'm talking to gets on board right away because they've already been told, hey, do this. This works. You're not going to believe how well it works and how quickly it works. Or then I talk to the other person who's talked to someone who hasn't filed. And they come in with this attitude like, okay, my mother, my brother, my sister, my buddy, fill in the blank, told me don't ever file bankruptcy. It's the worst thing you can do. And I say, okay, all right, well, why did they tell you that? Well, because it's just bad and it's going to hurt you and it's going to damage you. Okay, well, why is it going to hurt you and damage you? Well, because they said it is. And it's just there's not really even an argument there. It's just that they're just regurgitating something that someone else is regurgitating, and before long, the message is lost. They just think it's bad, and that just goes maybe back a couple generations. That people have this inherent feeling that doing this is wrong or bad, or I'm a good person, so I pay my debts. Okay, that's good. You should do that and pay your debts. But what you should also do is take care of your situation and take care of your family. And sometimes that means putting you and your family ahead of the creditors and getting that done. So it really depends on where that message comes from. Now, some people, as you say, just have this, maybe for some good reason, maybe for no reason at all, this bad taste in their mouth for attorneys. Maybe they had an experience with a bad attorney. It does happen. Maybe they had a bad experience with a good attorney, meaning that their situation was bad to start with, and they just didn't like how that felt, and they associate that with lawyers. Okay, that's possible. Maybe their only knowledge about attorneys is what they see on television. I can tell you, what we do is not that exciting. If you, it's not like the TV shows, the movies. It never is. But if you've been through a divorce and the only time you've dealt with a lawyer is through that divorce process, and it was a difficult, tough divorce, you may go into a bankruptcy scenario thinking, boy, I don't want to deal with lawyers again because all it reminds me of is that divorce. Or if you were accused of a crime, maybe a drunk driving or something like that, and your only experience with a lawyer is dealing with them in that capacity, and you had to pay a fine or spend a week in jail or something bad like that, maybe you're associating that with all lawyers, and then you don't want to come talk to a bankruptcy lawyer because you think it's going to be the same thing. And the truth of the matter is, let me kind of take you back to where I started, because I've done divorce cases for people, I've done criminal law cases for people, and I've done a few other things, before I landed on doing bankruptcy exclusively. And what I like the most about doing bankruptcy is that there's always a positive outcome. So when I used to do divorces, I'd have a client come in and she would say, okay, I want this, this, and this. And she'd wind up getting less than that because that's just the way divorces work. You have to share time with your kids. You have to share value of assets. You have to divvy up the debts. It sucks, but that's the way it is. I used to do, I did some drunk driving and some criminal cases. And, most of the time, the evidence is so overwhelming and mounting against you that you end up pleading guilty to something. Usually it's less than what you were charged with, but still, you got to pay a fine or something bad you don't like. In bankruptcy, you come in at your lowest and you come out without any of that baggage. The debts are gone, your stress is gone, you feel better, you're more communicative, you're better with your family, with your relationships, you do a better job at work. So I like seeing that. I like seeing that positive outcome. That's kind of why I started doing bankruptcies and stayed with it so long, because it's a good feeling to really help people and to be able to tell them, how this case is going to play out. I can tell you, and what I always tell my clients is, listen, if you tell me the truth and tell me everything I ask you, I can tell you exactly how this is going to play out. And most of the time, you're going to really like how I explain that. You're going to like my answer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I had never thought of it that way, comparing it to the other types of law and how somebody might have a bad taste in their mouth. I mean, certainly, there's plenty of lawyer jokes and, they don't fall from the sky. People do have some bad experiences. But, I think you're right. I think that is probably mostly from other types of law, whereas this is, just a way to have a positive outcome in the end. And I think that's fantastic. So let's talk about fear of the unknown, and let's really just take the fear of the unknown away and talk about the three outcomes that happen and, how you work with people by looking at the pros and cons. Because as you explained to me, sometimes it's all pros. It's all pros and you should do it in your situation. Sometimes it's a mixed bag and sometimes you shouldn't do it. And it just really depends on you and your situation, your debt, and what type of debt it is, what's coming up in the future for you, and if you even know. So, I mean, you really do work to sit down and figure out if this is the right solution for them when they come in with this problem. So let's talk about your pro and con process first, and then let's talk about the three outcomes.
Okay. Well, what I do is I try and measure the pros and cons of bankruptcy against the pros and cons of not filing bankruptcy. And what I mean by that is, when I meet with someone, I'll usually narrow their options down to four or five possibilities. The first possibility is continue with what you're doing the way you're doing it. What are the pros to that? Well, if we're talking, there probably aren't any pros because you're here. That's not working for you. So everything is in the con category. It doesn't work. So then next option, well, you owe $20,000 to your credit card companies, for example. Get a loan. Okay, well, the pros to that are that you don't file bankruptcy, but the cons are that, well, you got to pay the loan back. The interest might be just as bad. And in reality, are you really going to qualify for a loan? Then that's not really an option. One other option would be the debt consolidation option, which we already talked about. We've gone through that list of cons, and the pros there are very rare. And in those situations, if you want to settle your debts, pick up the phone and settle your debts. Do it yourself. I mean, anyone can make a phone call. It doesn't take a lawyer or a specialist to make a phone call and offer someone 5 or 10 cents on the dollar. You just offer that. That's it. So then we get to the pros and cons of bankruptcy. And the pros of filing bankruptcy are that you no longer have debt. You no longer are subject to collection actions. You're going to rebuild your credit score. You get to keep your assets. You get peace of mind. You're not stressed anymore. The list goes on and on and on and on. And the cons to filing bankruptcy, again, most of the time, there aren't any. I mean, there may be an occasional case where you have to file a bankruptcy and still pay a little bit of your debt back, but you've still minimized your exposure and you don't have to pay most of it back. So you've really gone, really, really far in solving your problem. Or maybe there is an asset you lose. Well, you have to kind of break that down. I mean, am I really losing everything? If a trustee liquidates an asset in bankruptcy, that doesn't mean they just get to keep it. You still get cash value to some extent for that. So it's not like you're losing everything. And again, those are the rare cases. It usually doesn't happen. Most cases, there's no liquidation of assets. So the list on the con side of bankruptcy is very, very short. And in most cases, it's empty. There just aren't any cons.
I like I said, I've never heard it explained that way. I think that's, really a fantastic way to think about it. Especially if you're in a situation where, you can't pay your bills and they're mounting and, the stress is building. And so when you're talking about pros and cons, I think, one of the cons for not going into bankruptcy, which we didn't mention earlier, but it was something that you and I had talked about in the past. And it's really how stress kills. And, you have to start looking at your stress level. So before we talk about the 3 things that happen when you file for bankruptcy that are just fantastic and awesome, I think this is one of them, is that the stress goes away. But, people don't talk about the fact that, you can get a lot of health problems, your family is disrupted, lots of different bad things happen with the stress of the unsolved issues.
Yeah, I mean, this, from a health perspective, just a regular healthy person alone, just alleviating the stress means so much. But then you take someone who, has some kind of compromising, debilitating condition or some disease or something. I mean, arthritis, lupus, cancer, whatever the symptoms are of that, having to deal with the stress of having debt and a constant barrage of phone calls coming at you from creditors only makes that worse. And I'm not a doctor, and I'm not here to give any medical advice, but it does. It makes it worse. You're compromising yourself more, and you're compromising your health more. And as we already talked about, you're compromising your relationships too. One of the biggest reasons for divorce are financial arguments. People just get to a point where neither one of them can solve the problem. It's all they want to do is fight about it. And that tension just builds and mounts, and it spills over into other aspects of their relationships. And so you wind up with just these irreconcilable differences that stemmed from a debt problem that, most likely could have been resolved fairly easily and not without spending a whole lot of money. So yeah, it really, it has all kinds of positive, intangible outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's great. I really do feel like, anyone who's gone through any kind of stressful situation like divorce or bankruptcy or, or death, or, they know that there's, a loss of sleep and there's, health problems that pop up that you didn't know you had. You might end up sick a lot more often. You're more susceptible to that. Your immune system is down when you're not getting sleep, and I mean, it just compiles into, just a giant mess. And so, you're really going to solve a lot of issues when you feel better, and your family will feel better too. So let's talk about the three positive outcomes that you see people experience with bankruptcy.
Yeah, so we talked about the intangibles, and these three things we're going to talk about are what I consider to be the tangible outcomes, the things you can actually look at and see happening almost right away, in some cases right away. The first of which is when you file bankruptcy, all right, whether it's Chapter 7 or Chapter 13. We'll get into what that means at a later time. When you file bankruptcy, the very first thing that happens is you get protection from your creditors, all right? There's a federal judge who signs an order that creates a protection or a stay from any collection actions. So what that means is that you no longer will be called by your creditors. They legally can't call you. They can't garnish your paycheck. They can't foreclose on your house. They can't repossess your car. They can't take any measures or actions that could be construed as collection efforts. And there's a federal judge sitting there on a bench in a federal court who has your back on that. So the judge is on your side and the law is on your side. All right. So that's just the first positive outcome. You're protected. The second positive outcome is that very same judge a few months later is going to sign another order that says that those debts that you had no longer exist. So rather than owing Citibank $5,000 and American Express $10,000 and City Hospital $20,000, you don't owe anybody anything. Those debts are gone, they're canceled, they're discharged. And that same federal judge who has your back has said so in writing. Okay, so that's number two. And then once that's done, the third thing, which we kind of touched on earlier, is we're going to rebuild your credit score. Now, you stop the bleeding and the wound is starting to heal, but now we have to grow back. We have to build up again. And so just by getting rid of the debts alone, not having those creditors report to your credit bureaus in a negative way every month, you've done something toward rebuilding your credit score. Your credit score is to some extent going to naturally rebuild every month that goes by because your history is going to get better. And the bad stuff, the debt, the delinquencies, the judgments, those are farther and farther away in your rear view mirror. So that's going to help your credit score in and of itself. However, we will also enroll you in a credit rebuilding program where there are proactive steps that you can take, very easy to understand, easy to implement steps that you take to help to drive your score forward and upward a lot quicker than it would just go on its own. And so to summarize that, again, you're stopping the bleeding. You're cutting off the creditors, no more collections, okay? You're starting to heal the wound. You're getting rid of the debts. The debts don't exist anymore. And then we're going to start to rebuild, and that's when your credit score starts to go up. So like I say, usually within a year to 2 years of filing bankruptcy, you can have done all that stuff and have a very good credit score at that point, where you can qualify for all of the healthy types of loans, good car loans, car leases, things like that you need to move on with life.
It sounds like you're really, pruning the bushes, and things are going to grow back, better once you get rid of the dead leaves. And, I really think that, it's a fantastic way to explain it. You made some really great points. And I hope that everybody is really listening intently to the information that you've given today. It's been a long interview. And, we've really gone over from the beginning where we're talking about, the reasons people should file for bankruptcy, and the reasons, what happens in life which would cause them to consider it, in addition to what happens, some of the reasons people wouldn't want to file. And then the last thing is like what actually happens. So I think the real information is the most important thing here. And so I'm really glad that, we've been able to do this today. I wanted to just give you an opportunity to, say anything that we might have missed in our extensive interview, Is there anything that we should know before we go today?
Well, I mean, I feel like we've covered everything, and I have that same feeling that I have when I come out of a consultation with a client. Like I know that I've hit everything because I've got this progression in my mind that I take when I go through these steps with people, and I feel like we've accomplished that today. But again, there are there are some reasons and some times when you don't file bankruptcy, and more times than not, if you're having debt problems like you probably are, you do want to at least consult with a bankruptcy lawyer. Again, I can't say it enough. We're available and we're here to help, and we don't judge people. I mean, we're here to protect you and help you. I can't say it any plainer. But get as much information as you can from knowledgeable sources before you make decisions. And what I mean by that is, and you can Google things all you want, but you're not going to solve problems by Googling things. You're going to get a whole bunch of opinions and mixed messages and misinformation sometimes. If you're contemplating bankruptcy, or even if you're not, but you're having some discomfort with debt, call us. Get some information. Let's talk. It doesn't cost you anything to have a conversation. And it just might put you in the right frame of mind. Or maybe you don't need to file bankruptcy, but maybe hearing that just helps you go forward in another direction with a confident attitude. Because you want to be sure you're on the right track, whether you're filing bankruptcy or not filing bankruptcy, or whether you're doing whatever it might be in your life. It's always good to be confident that you're doing the right thing. So to hear that from an expert usually will help you, know that you're on the right path.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been just so much information, and you are so kind to give us all of this, so that we can make good decisions. And the first decision is to pick up the phone and give HS&A a call, because they are there to help you. I think that throughout this interview, really shown that you have caring and empathy for your clients, and that you're really just trying to help them get their life back on track. And what are the consequences if you do nothing? You're just going to have the same problem, and it's just going to grow. And this is where HS&A can help. So thanks again, Tim, for joining us today. You spent so much time, and we really do appreciate it.
My pleasure, Erica. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you.